A lot of debate lately over the group Antifa and how positive or negative a force they represent. A lot of people on the left are framing them sort of as freedom fighters who are fighting against Nazis. The phrase "punch a Nazi" has become sort of a catchphrase on the left, and calls for violence on both sides are becoming more and more prevalent. And this is symptomatic of the sort of breakdown of discussion and the increasing polarization that we're currently experiencing in this country as the left and the right continue to veer off into radically different directions. The left is becoming more radical and the right is becoming more radical simultaneously, and that's a sort of a scary situation, to be honest with you. So the first thing I want to point out is because the title of this video is attacking Antifa, and people are going to come in and probably, if anybody even responds, accuse me of being a Nazi sympathizer or enabler, etc. Because this is what I've experienced online. When you try to debate these things and you try to express concerns about Antifa, people come in and basically accuse you of being an enabler of the sort of tiki torch Nazi people. So let me just say that unlike Donald Trump, I have no problem denouncing Nazis. I hate Nazis. I don't believe what they stand for. I think they're reprehensible. I don't agree with them across the board. And I think that they pose a bigger threat right now than Antifa does. But I don't see a lot of people, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, I don't see a lot of people in the mainstream circles on the right coming to the defense of the Nazis and saying that these people are actually, that they're pursuing something worthwhile or something worthy of praising. I don't see them get a lot of mainstream acceptance. They seem like they're a bigger and more dangerous group than Antifa, but pretty much anybody is going to denounce them. Anybody who's sane is going to denounce them. So it doesn't seem to me like there's a lot of controversy over that. I think we all pretty much agree that they're terrible. We instinctively as Americans, for the most part, we have a disdain for Nazis because we still remember World War II and what went on there. But Antifa seems to get a lot more acceptance, especially on the left. And I think that really they're low-rate thugs. To be honest with you, they strike me as low-rate thugs looking for an adventure. They're looking for their moment to feel like these radical activists, and they're just going out and attacking random people. And then the people on the sidelines who cheer them on the left are saying, yeah, well, I agree with punching Nazis. But when they just attack this Asian guy, and I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know his name. I don't know how to pronounce it. I know it's NGO, but I don't know how you pronounce that. No or no. I don't know how you pronounce that. When they attack this guy, I don't know anything about him, but I've done a little bit of Googling online to see any indication that he's some sort of Nazi, and I'm not finding anything. I'm not finding any evidence whatsoever that the guy's a Nazi, and it's kind of hard to imagine that this little gay Asian guy is a Nazi in the first place. So it seems like they're just, anybody who's disagreeing with them is Nazis. And so the punch a Nazi starts to take on a whole different meaning once you start expanding that outgroup to include more and more people. I don't think you should be punching real Nazis either, because initiating violence is a dangerous thing to do. And so I think really it's not going to solve anything. It's only going to further that fight. It's only going to continue to escalate that situation. It's funny because they like to frame themselves as these descendants of the people at D-Day who were fighting against the Nazis in the war. As if they're doing the same thing that those people were doing, but they're not. Those people were at war. It was an actual war, and they were going and fighting against other troops. That takes some balls, especially in World War II, with the casualty rates that they had. You had a very good chance of going home in a pine box. There's no comparison to going up on the street and attacking civilians who you disagree with. And the funny part is that there were actually Nazis and communists, and I think these Antifa types are largely of that ilk. They're largely like far left, communist, socialist types, who anarchists maybe, who they were fighting it out in the streets in Weimar Germany in the 1920s before the rise of the Nazis. This was a big part of how the Nazis came into prominence, how they came to become such a dominant force in German culture, was the brown shirts and the communists fighting it out in the streets. And they would recruit people into the brown shirts or the SA, and it gave people a sense of belonging, a group to belong to, and this was a large part of how the Nazis grew as this movement. So this idea that you're going to prevent another Nazi Germany from going out in the streets and punching Nazis is not taking your lessons from history very, very seriously, because we already had that happening in the first case when Nazis came about. It didn't stop it from happening. What would stop it from happening in our case is our institutions are more robust than Weimar Germany's, and engaging in the system civilly and politically, and just having faith that the Nazi ideas are not going to prevail, that most people are going to disagree with them, and that they're going to end up being this sort of marginalized group, a subset, fringe group of the population, the same way that they seem to have been not only 10, 20 years ago. It seems like nobody was taking Nazis seriously. They existed, but they weren't like this major component of the discussion. They certainly weren't coming out in the sort of numbers that we saw in Charleston and marching in the streets. That was extremely disturbing to see that happen. That was extremely troubling. But it's also troubling the approach that the left, not the whole left, but Antifa, is taking in response, because basically they're co-opting the tactics of the Nazis. They just have a different ideology. Let me be clear. The problem with Nazis is not just that they're racist. That's one problem with Nazis. That's a big problem with Nazis, but it's not the only one. A big problem with Nazis is that they're jackbooted thugs and totalitarians who don't allow for any sort of deviating from the party line, and that's what made it such a, in addition to their racial ideology, that's what made it such an oppressive regime to live under, because without the racial component you have something like Stalinism or communism, where it was arguably just as bad to live under. It was just as oppressive, just as totalitarian, just as repressive, but they didn't have this racial ideology. So the racial ideology is terrible, but you take that out of the mix, the Nazis are still problematic. So you shouldn't be co-opting their tactics, which is basically to act like jackbooted thugs and to use force on people who are being peaceful and things of this nature. If you do that while denouncing Nazis, I think you're being a hypocrite, because you're only partially denouncing Nazis. You're only denouncing one component of what they represent. You're not denouncing a lot of the things that make them such a danger to Western civil society. And so it's kind of interesting that we've come full circle after about 100 years. About 100 years ago, Germany was just recovering from the loss of the First World War, and the stages were being set for the eventual rise of the Third Reich in Weimar Germany. The political circumstances were basically being set, and at the time you had communists and you had Nazis, and they were fighting it out in the streets. And now we're seeing the same thing today. Now, am I drawing a straight parallel and saying that we're going to go? No, because it's, like I say, very different circumstances, very different. The American government, the institutions are much more robust and long-standing than Weimar Germany's, and the circumstances of the time were much more extreme. So there's plenty of reason to be hopeful. It's just a little chilling, nonetheless, that we haven't really got over this fight. I thought we got over it a while ago, but it seems that some of the ideologies, the three ideologies that were competing for dominance in the West in the early 20th century, one of them being basically liberal capitalism, democracy, or whatever, and then the other two being communism and fascism. We thought that communism and fascism had sort of fallen by the wayside for the most part, especially fascism, and now both of them are re-emerging in pretty prominent ways across the world. You look at the rise of the far-right populist movements in Europe, and look at the turn towards more and more socialist programs, maybe not straight up communist programs, in the United States, which always seemed to be an impossibility for so long. Now we've got candidates basically openly running as socialists and being accepted for it, and then on top of it, we've got our own far right that's on the rise in the United States, and then we have these far left radicals that are acting like jackbooted thugs, even though they're a minority, they're a fringe, they don't represent the left as a whole. They're gaining more acceptance than I would like to see them gain. I would caution people to try to learn the lessons of history. Don't let partisan politics blind you. What's right is right, regardless of who does it, if they're on your side or not.